An elderly black woman is humiliatingly forced to kneel in the middle of the street. The police officers revel in their power while the crowd around them silently watches. But one unexpected event changes everything. How far can impunity go? And what happens when someone decides to break the silence? Subscribe to find out the sequel, and write in the comments where you're watching from. Martha adjusted her worn scarf against the chilly evening breeze as she strolled home from the small town library, her usual destination after a long day of volunteer work. At 71, she had long since earned the respect of those around her. Known for her warm smile and wise demeanor, Martha exuded a quiet strength that belied the struggle she had faced over the decades. She had lived in this town her entire life, watching it change, slowly, seeing new faces, new buildings. And yet some things seemed like they'd never change at all. The sun had set only moments ago, leaving behind streaks of deep orange and purple in the sky, casting the town in a gentle twilight glow. Normally, she found comfort in the familiar visions of the small southern town with its brick buildings and oak-lined streets. But tonight an unsettling feeling prickled at the back of her mind. The road seemed emptier than usual, and the usual sounds of evening chatter and distant traffic felt muffled, as though the whole town was holding its breath. Her walk took her through a small, nearly deserted park, one she had traversed countless times before. Fallen leaves scattered along the path crackled underfoot, breaking the stillness. And as she passed the ancient fountain in the center of the park, Martha's sense of unease grew. The fountain, with its chipped stonework and ivy creeping along its base, was a familiar landmark, a comforting relic of her childhood. But tonight it felt ominous, its silent water like an unblinking eye staring back at her. She quickened her steps, telling herself not to be foolish, but the feeling persisted. Rounding in a corner, she noticed a lone patrol car parked a short distance away, its headlight cutting through the dim light. The car was a strange presence. This part of town rarely saw much police activity. Not in the still hours of the night, at any rate. Martha's heart quickened slightly, a ghostly resonance of old fears, memories she had laid to rest but never truly forgotten. She had always walked among the ambiguities of prejudice, knowing when to remain quiet, when to stand tall, and when to absent herself from the situation altogether. Yet now, as she walked nearer, she could not rid herself of the impression that someone was watching her. As Martha continued walking, attempting to keep her poise, she flung only a quick glance towards the patrol car. The ones inside looked to be deep in discussion, but one of them, a short man with a cool stare, turned his head as she passed, and for one fleeting, chilling moment, their eyes met. Martha sensed something between curiosity and malice flicker in his gaze. Her instincts told her to look away, but she held his stare a fraction longer, her resolve refusing to yield. Then she turned back to her path, joining the queue, her pace steady with determination not to be intimidated by the silent threat. Yet the feeling of being followed grew noticeably stronger with every step. More than just a sensation, it was the culmination of years of learned caution, knowing how quickly circumstances could go from peaceful to perilous. The pace quickened as she neared the edge of the park, her eyes set on the distant lights of home just a few blocks away. But before she could reach the main road, the patrol car rolled forward, its headlight beams now fully falling on her path. Martha froze, her hands tightening around the strap of her bag as it stopped right next to her. The doors opened in unison, and two officers stepped out, their movements slow and predators closing in on prey, deliberate. The man who had locked eyes with her earlier was now directly in her path, and a wave of dread settled over her. His name tag read green, and his expression was one of thinly veiled contempt. His partner, a younger officer with a slightly uncertain look in his eyes, followed closely behind but kept his gaze averted, as if uncomfortable with what was about to unfold. "Evening, ma'am," Officer Green said, his tone overly polite, a mocking undertone threatening through the words. "Out for a stroll, are we?" Martha forced a calm smile, though her heart was racing. "Yes, officer. Just heading home after shift at the library." Green raised an eyebrow, looking her up and down as though appraising her. "A bit late for a woman your age to be out alone. Don't you think I'm used to it?" she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Lived here all my life. I know the streets better than most." "Oh, I don't doubt that," Green said with a smirk. He took a step closer, invading her personal space. "But you see, There's been some suspicious activity in this area recently, and it's my job to keep things safe, you understand. That don't you?" Martha felt her pulse quicken. She could sense where this conversation was headed, but she held her ground. "I understand that, officer, but I haven't done anything wrong." Green's smirk grew wider. "Funny, isn't it how the ones who claim innocence always have something to hide?" The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, casting a wary glance at Green. "Maybe we should let her go." "Officer," he murmured, but Green silenced him with a glare. Martha's heart sank. She had seen men wanted Green before, men who used authority as a weapon, who fed on intimidation and fear. She had spent a lifetime learning how to work around people like him. But tonight the years weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had a feeling Green wasn't going to let her walk away without a fight. "You know," Green said, the words low, a threat. "Respect goes a long way, and from where I'm standing, it looks like you've got a lot to learn in that department." He paused, letting the words sink in, before continuing. "Maybe you should hug their knees and apologize. Show a little humility." The words cut into her like a slap. Martha felt her cheeks ablaze, the indignity of the demand mingling with a sharp, bitter anger. She could feel the weight of his words beat upon her, demanding submission, stripping her of dignity before all. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the raised voices and the aggressive dance of the officers. People watched, some with curiosity, others with discomfort, but no one stepped forward to intervene. Martha swallowed, struggling to keep her voice calm. "I have nothing to apologize for," she said in a low, firm tone. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, the collective judgment and apathy that seemed to cling around her like an aura. Green's face hardened. He moved closer still, pushing her backward until she felt the rough bark of the tree on her spine. "Oh, I think you do, ma'am. If you don't, then things are apt to get just a bit uncomfortable for everybody." Martha's mind raced, her thoughts consumed with images, flashing scenes from her childhood. Those moments that flickered through her psyche, when she had witnessed her parents who had been through similar situations, her father's silent defiance, her mother's whispered words of bravery. She had spent a lifetime preparing for moments like these, but now as she looked into Green's unyielding stare in the expectant crowd, a wave of helplessness threatened to overcome her. Slowly, with reluctance, she dropped to one knee, feeling the cold, unforgiven earth press against her. The humiliation washed over her, a bitter taste that filled her mouth as she looked up at Green, who watched her with triumph in his smile. "See," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" The crowd murmured, a mixture of shocked disgust and helplessness rippling through them. Some looked away, unable to bear the sight. Others simply stared as if transfixed by the spectacle of a proud woman brought low. But as Martha knelt there, she felt something shift within her, a spark of resistance igniting in her chest. She was no stranger to humiliation, to being made to feel less than human. But this time, she would not let it break her. She would remember this moment, hold on to it, and use it for fuel for the battles yet to come. As the officers finally backed away, leaving her kneeling on the sea-cold ground, Martha knew this was only the beginning. Martha rose slowly from the ground, the cold dampness of the earth clinging to her knee as she steadied herself, aware that every eye in the gathering crowd was fixed on her. She avoided their gazes, unwilling to let anyone see the shame and pain that simmered beneath her calm exterior. The humiliation she had just been made to suffer was a fresh wound, but deep inside her, a fierce resolution was building. She knew all too well that submission, however forced, was only another form of survival. Yet every moment of that survival came at a heavy price, eroded in her dignity bit by bit. As she straightened up, Officer Green stood with his arms crossed, watching her with an expression of smug satisfaction. His younger partner looked away, shifting uncomfortably, his face a mask of cayenne, as though wrestling with some sort of conflict that he couldn't express. The crowd murmured their collective discomfort, palpable in the air, yet none stepped forward to break the oppressive silence. Martha saw several in the crowd avert their eyes, either unwilling or unable to face the injustice unfolding before them. She could not help but think of how it had been, scenes from her youth when she had marched and protested, and endured the endless stream of insults, threats, and assaults. She had believed in that deepest part of her heart that those battles had been fought and won, that her lifetime of struggle had led to real change. And yet here she was again, In front of a crowd of silent witnesses facing an all-too-familiar enemy, the bitter irony of it twisted within her like a knife. But she took a deep breath, refusing to let despair take hold. Green tilted his head, his smirk fading slightly, as he seemed to notice the look in her eyes, the barely contained spark of defiance. "What's the matter?" he sneered. "Didn't expect a little humility to be so hard." Martha met his gaze with steely resolve, forcing herself to stand tall. "I'm not here to cause trouble, officer," she said quietly, but there was an unmistakable edge to her words. "I lived in this town longer than you, and know right from wrong. Is that so?" Green's expression darkened, and he took a step closer, his voice dripping with contempt. "Maybe you think you're above the law, but out here respect is earned, not given, and you're still a long way from earning it." Lady, the younger officer, standing slightly behind Green, cleared his throat. "Maybe we should move on, Officer." "Green, the first don't think she's." Green cut him off with a withering glare. "I don't pay you to think, Andrews. So why don't you handle this?" Andrews opened his mouth to protest, but then snapped it shut, his shoulders sagging as he turned away. Martha watched this interchange carefully, noting an opportunity. Maybe this young officer Andrews had not inured himself to the viciousness that Green so obviously reveled in. She filed this observation for future reference, tucking the memory away in case she might ever have need of an ally, even a reluctant one. Around them the crowd continued to grow, a silent mass of townsfolk who had assembled out of a curiosity or perhaps even guilt, but none who dared to speak out. In the front row of onlookers, Martha knew a boy, a young man actually, often in the library where she worked volunteering. His eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and fascination, and for one instant their eyes met. Martha saw something flicker in his expression, a glimmer of empathy, perhaps even of courage, but it passed swiftly. He turned away, overcome by the weight of the moment. Green felt the crowd's mood shift, the uneasy murmur that had begun to ripple through them. He took a step back, surveying the onlookers with a challenging glare. "What are you all looking at?" he snapped, his voice laced with contempt. "You've got something to say? Anyone here think they know the law better than me?" "No one," responded the crowd. Cow and uneasy avoided his gaze. Green's smirk returned, and he turned his attention back to Martha, satisfied that his authority remained unquestioned. "See," he said softly, as if speaking only to her, "no one here is going to help you. They're all just here and watch." As Martha's heart ached with disappointment as she regarded the people she called neighbors, friends, and even family, the weight of their silence pressed down on her, reminding her that in times of true conflict, people usually turned inward in search of safety over solidarity. But despite the instilled fear and shame, their words would not turn her from her dignity. Without warning, Green reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip rough and unyielding. "You think you're some kind of martyr?" he whispered, low and threatening. "I could have you locked up right now. Who would stop me?" Martha's pulse quickened as his words sank, and she knew he could make good on his threat, knew that any resistance could escalate the situation beyond control. But a fire burned within her, one that she had kept alive for all these years. She had endured too much sacrifice, too much to let herself be intimidated by a man like Green. Taking a steadying breath, she looked him directly in the eyes. "You might have the badge, officer, but you don't have my respect. That's something you'll never earn." Green's face twisted in anger, his fingers digging deep in her arm as he turned and tightened his hold on her. The moment was taut as a bowstring, trembling with menace, poised on the threshold of hurt. But then from the back of the crowd, a voice sliced through the air, clear and firm. "Let her go." Everyone turned, heads swiveling, as one young woman stepped forward, an intent look on her face, fierce and resolute. Martha knew her as Sarah, one of the younger citizens of the town, and Sarah had only moved here some months previously, but had quickly become known for her outspoken stance on social justice issues, a rarity in this quiet, conservative town. Sarah was younger, perhaps in her early 30s, with a quiet strength that reminded Martha of herself in her youth. Green turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "And who are you supposed to be?" "Someone who wants stand by and watch this happen," Sarah replied, her voice unwavering. "What you're doing is wrong. And you know what?" A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd as Sarah's words cut through the tension. Martha felt a surge of gratitude toward this young woman who, despite the odds, had chosen to stand with her. Sarah's defiance was a spark, a reminder that there were still people willing to speak out against injustice, even when it was easier to remain silent. Green's jaw tightened, and he released Martha's arm, stepping towards Sarah. With an intimidating glare, "You think you can tell me how to do my job?" he demanded, his voice dripping with hostility. "You think you know what it takes to keep this town safe? What you are doing has nothing to do with safety." Sarah shot him a look, refusing to back down. "It's about control, about making someone feel small because you can, and I won't take that." Martha sat in wonder as Sarah stood firm, the words speaking quietly inside, but filled with a depth of emotion that was at once both so familiar and so inspiring. Sarah's strength reignited a smoldering flame within Martha, reminding her that the struggle was far from over. For a fleeting instant, all the years seemed to disappear, and Martha stood as she had once done when she was young, standing alongside other women who believed in what she believed in. Green's face contorted in anger, but he seemed to realize the pointlessness of further confrontation. The crowd, emboldened by Sarah's defiance, was starting to turn, murmurs of agreement breaking through the silence. He shot one last, hateful look at Martha before turning to his partner. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice low and sulky. Andrews looked relieved, his face softening as he glanced at Martha with a mixture of sympathy and regret. As the officers retreated to their patrol car, the crowd began to disperse, murmurs of disbelief and disgust lingering in the air. Martha stayed stock still, her heart pounding as the tension slowly seeped away. Sarah drew near to her, her face softening as she laid a reassuring hand on the back of Martha's shoulder. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. Martha nodded, her voice catching in her throat as the struggle to find the right words finally came to an end. "Thank you," she whispered, the weight of gratitude and relief settling over her. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up." Sarah smiled, a warm, encouraging expression that filled Martha with a sense of hope. "Sometimes it only takes one person to make a difference," she replied softly. "You've spent your life standing up for others, Martha. It's about time someone stood up for you." Martha felt the lump form in her throat, touched by Sarah's words and the strength of her conviction. She looked around at the now empty street, the remnants of the confrontation still lingering in the cool evening air. The pain and humiliation were still fresh, but she knew that tonight had been a turning point, a reminder that the fight for justice was ongoing and that no longer alone. Not even in old age, she was not alone in that tussle as the two walked away, shoulder to shoulder. Martha was filled with a new sense of resolve that she would not be silenced, and neither would injustices of her past define her future. With people like Sarah standing beside her, she knew the battle was far from over, that together they could forge some sort of path toward a better tomorrow. Martha walked away from the park, having Sarah by her side, each step laced with humiliation, tempered somewhat by this brave act of the young woman. But Sarah was a comforting intervention, a reminder that even during the dark times, there were still people who would stand up for what was right. Yet the anger and shame of her experience with Officer Green still churned in the pit of her stomach, casting a shadow over the slight comfort she felt. The events of this evening had left a sour taste in Martha's mouth, and she found herself replaying Green's words in her mind. She had felt the raw intent behind them, the deep-seated prejudice that seemed to ooze from his every gesture. In her long life, she had seen many faces like his twisted with hate and contempt, faces that seemed to revel in the pain they inflicted. But tonight, for the first time in years, she had been made to go through it all again, reminded that the battles she thought were behind her were still lurking, just waiting for an opportunity to resurface. As they approached her tiny, weathered home on the edge of town, Sarah touched Martha's arm, lightly drawing her from her musings. "Martha, do you want me to come in with you?" she asked quietly. "I don't mind lingering if you need someone to talk to." Martha forced a smile, though her heart was still heavy. "I appreciate that, Sarah, I really do, but I think I just need a little time to myself." Sarah nodded, her expression sympathetic. "If you change your mind, you know where to find me. You shouldn't have to go through this alone." Martha's smile became a little warmer, the weight of gratitude lightening her spirits just a bit. "Thank you, Sarah. You don't know how much it means to me that you stood up back there. It was the least I could do." Sarah replied, "People like Green, they're dangerous. And if we don't stand up to them, they'll just keep on doing this to people, to our friends, our neighbors." Martha nodded, a flicker of resolve igniting in her heart. "You're right, I've spent too much of my life turning the other cheek, but maybe it's time to start standing up again." With a final reassuring squeeze of her hand, Sarah was gone, leaving Martha alone with her thoughts. The silence of her home felt heavy, pressing in around her as she moved through the small, dimly lit rooms. She could still feel the sharp sting of Green's words, the way in which he had looked at her with his cold, calculated cruelty, as if he had relished to make her nothing, ridicule her, and strip away her dignity for all to see and know. Back in the quiet solitude of her living room, Martha sat down and let the full weight of the day fall upon her. Her mind began to wander back to the past, to those moments when similar treatment had been something with which she had to cope. Long-buried memories began to surface, unbidden yet painfully vivid, of her youth when she had made to feel so small. Apologized for her very existence to feign and pretend that she was somehow less deserving of respect and decency. She remembered her father, his strong hands wrapped around hers as he told her never to let go of pride. She remembered the quiet resilience of her mother, the way she had endured so much with a grace that defied the cruelty of the world surrounding her. Those memories brought a small sense of comfort, yet they also reminded her of the unspoken promise she had made to herself so many years ago, a promise that she would never again allow anyone to strip her of her dignity. As the night wore on, Martha found herself growing restless. She knew she couldn't just sit back and accept what had happened, but she also knew it wouldn't be easy standing up against someone like Green. Men like him held the power of the badge, and the entire town seemed to turn a blind eye to their actions. Martha had spent a lifetime fighting, but this time felt different. She was older now, tired from years of struggle, and the thought of facing Green again filled her with a deep, gnawing did not savor the morning after. The next morning, Martha woke up early, her head still reeling from the experience of the night before. She went through her morning routine in a daze, her thoughts loose and weighty, but as she attended to her chores, a resolve began to settle upon her. She could no longer afford to let the likes of Green continue unchecked. If she said nothing now, it would only serve to embolden him, making it easier for him to victimize others in the future. Her resolve was strengthened later that day when she went out to the local grocery store. As she was browsing the shelves, she noticed the stares of a few familiar faces, neighbors and acquaintances who had obviously heard about the incident in the park. Some avoided her gaze, while others watched her with a mixture of pity and discomfort. The weight of their scrutiny made her feel small, as though she were once again kneeling on the cold ground, forced to endure their judgment. But then, as she rounded a corner near the produce section, she saw a familiar face. Jacob, the young man who had been in the crowd the previous night, stood awkwardly by the apples, his hands fluttering as he saw her. Martha stopped, unsure whether to go to him. But Jacob moved first, coming over with a look of quiet resolve. "Martha, I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have done something. I should have thought, I don't know, try to stop him." Martha smiled at him soft, but the ache in her heart was still too fresh. "It's all right, Jacob. You were there. Sometimes that's enough, just to bear witness." He shook his head, his face troubled. "I don't know if that's true. I could have risen up like Sarah did, but I was scared." "Fear is an incredibly powerful thing," Martha replied quietly. "It has kept a lot of people silent for a long time. But you're young, Jacob. You have time to learn and grow, and perhaps the next time you might find the strength to speak out." Jacob looked at her. A flicker of hope brightened his gaze. "Maybe," he whispered, "but you shouldn't have had to go through it. None of us should even have to see it, let alone endure it." Martha nodded, feeling a rise in her chest of thankfulness about Jacob's words. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small glimmer of support in a town that so often turned a blind eye to injustice. As they parted ways, she felt a renewed sense of determination. She couldn't allow Green's actions to go unchallenged. She owed it to herself, to her parents, and to all the people who over the years had endured similar treatment. Over the next few days, Martha began to prepare herself for the inevitable confrontation that she knew was coming. She started by reaching out to a few close friends, those whom she knew shared her beliefs and her desire for justice, quietly gathered support as she shared her story, urging others to stand with her. She knew facing Green alone would have been deadly, but facing him with the community's support, the cards were on her side. However, Green seemed to feel her resolve getting stronger and his intimidation tactics upped a notch. Driving by her house late at night, his patrol car's lights flashing ominously through her windows or tailgating her on errands, always letting her know he was watching her. The silent threat hung in the air. If she'd make her life a living hell if she dared to speak out. One evening, the tension boiled over when Martha was walking home from a strategy meeting with Sarah and a few other supporters. As Martha proceeded down the deserted street, she spotted a too familiar car parked at the corner. Her heart hit rock bottom because she recognized Green's patrol car and his murky figure behind the wheel. He didn't approach her, but his mere presence sent cold chills down her spine. The pace of her walk quickened as she felt his gaze. While that night, Martha rushed home and lay in bed, frightened and angry. She knew Green was trying to break her, force her into submission through intimidation. Yet she also knew giving in now would only worsen things. The victory would be his, but also of all those who prosper from fear and hatred. It was in those early morning hours when dawn was already breaking over the town that a decision was made by Martha. No longer would she be a victim in silence. She would stand up against Green, whatever the cost. Would draw on the strength of her forefathers, on the resiliency of her parents, and on the support of the few friends she had made. This battle would not be won easily, but she was ready for whatever lay ahead. As the first light of dawn crept through her window and cast its golden glow across her room, Martha felt that surge of determination. She had borne all that life had dished out to her thus far, and she would endure this too. With a deep breath, she rose from her bed, ready to face the battle awaiting her. Martha woke with a quiet but unyielding determination. The resolve she'd discovered in the early hours of morning hadn't faded. If anything, it had only deepened. She knew that Green's threats would escalate, that his intimidation would hang over her head like some dark specter. Martha had finally decided that she would no longer yield to fear. She would fight back now. Her first act was to ring Sarah, who had shown such courage that night in the park. Sarah's approval meant the world to Martha, not only for standing up to Green, but also for the simple act of solidarity. Martha felt as certain she could muster up others to her cause. She had lived for too long in silence now, with the courage of a new generation standing with her. She felt her voice growing stronger. She called Sarah that morning, her voice steady and firm. "I've made up my mind," Martha told her. "I won't let Green get away with what he's doing, but I can't do it alone." "You don't have to, Martha. In with you whatever you need. We'll do it together." Together, they decided to build a small group of the like-minded. Those who had been victimized or who had witnessed injustice in town, but who up till now had felt powerless to do anything about it. Martha knew the only way to take on Green was in unity, in the collective strength of people who had enough of living in fear. With Sarah's help, she began reaching out to others, friends and neighbors. Even strangers had heard what had happened and were anxious to lend their support. The group met that evening in the back room of a local community center, a modest space filled with folding. There were chairs and some old, dusty posters about town events, but the meager surroundings could not stifle the energy in the room. Every person in that room had a story, a piece of the town's tapestry of unspoken prejudices and lingering fears. Some were slow to open up at first, casting wary glances around the room, unsure of who they could trust. That doubt and fear began to dissolve as Martha started to speak. With quiet strength, Martha told her story, frankness lacing the telling of what happened that night, leaving no room for pity. Her words painted a vivid an icon of Green's intimidation and the cruelty of cold satisfaction had taken in humiliating her. She spoke to the history she had carried with her, the weight of past struggles, and the urge to finally stand up against forces that have kept her and so many others silent for so long. As she spoke, others in the room started to open up to share their experiences. Some told stories about run-ins they'd had with Green, and other officers who acted like a badge gave them license to do whatever they wished without consequence. Others spoke of the quiet racism that had festered in the town for years, of small slights and indignities they had been forced to endure. There was Jacob, the young man who had watched in the park, whose face still bore traces of guilt as he spoke about the shame of not stepping forward, of allowing fear to keep silent. But Martha reassured him. Courage was a journey, and every step forward, no matter how small, was a victory unto itself. And there was Emma, single mother, who had seen her teenage son stop by Green for no apparent reason other than the color of his skin. She had felt powerless to protect him, knowing full well that any resistance would only make things worse. Clutching Martha's hand as she spoke, her voice was trembling but full of deep, unspoken strength. The room hummed with shared stories and quiet affirmations, each person's tale adding another layer to the tapestry of injustice. They wove a collective truth they would no longer allow to be ignored. The energy in the room grew, a palpable force of unity and determination. Martha felt her own strength rising. With every word together, they began to form a plan. They would approach the town council, demand a formal investigation into Green's actions, and garner signatures from the people of the town to show they would no longer stand for any abuse of power. It was a simple plan, but it was something a way to make their voices heard in a town that had too often turned a blind eye to its own failings. As the meeting began to wind down, Sarah pulled Martha aside. "We'll need more than just signatures to bring Green down," she said quietly. "He has connections he's protected." Martha nodded, understanding the truth of Sarah's words. Green was deeply embedded in the town's power structure with friends and allies who would defend him. But Martha also knew that for the first time in her life, she wasn't alone in this fight. The days that followed were tense. Martha and her group worked tirelessly, gathering signatures, speaking to neighbors, and sharing their stories. Some people supported them openly, while others offered only quiet encouragement. Fearful of reprisal, the whispers of resistance spread through town, filling the air with a sense of anticipation, a feeling that something was about to change. But Green was not one to be outdone. He seemed to sense the building opposition and countered with a quiet but relentless campaign of intimidation. Patrol cars started to show up outside the homes of those who had attended the meeting. Late-night knocks on the door, inquiries about suspected events, veiled threats. A new atmosphere boiled over in tension in town. A silent battle was waged in the shadows as Green sought to maintain his grip on power. One evening, as Martha walked home from another meeting, she felt a familiar chill run down her spine. She turned a corner only to find herself face to face with Green, his patrol car idling behind him. He stood in the middle of the sidewalk, arms crossed, his eyes cold and unblinking. "Going somewhere, Martha?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock politeness. Martha held her ground, refusing to let him see her fear. "Just heading home," she replied, her voice steady. Green took a step closer, invading her personal space. "You know, Martha, some people don't know when to quit. They stir up trouble, thinking they're doing something noble, and all they end up doing is making life harder for themselves." She met his gaze, unflinching. "If anyone's making life harder for the people in this town, it's you, Officer Green." A flicker of anger crossed his face, and for a moment, Martha saw the raw hatred lurking beneath his polished exterior. "Careful, Martha," he said softly. "You wouldn't want something unfortunate to happen." Martha felt her heart race, but she did not back off. She continued to stare at him, her eyes cold, dogged. "I'm not afraid of you, Green. You can try to scare me, but I've been through worse, and I won't stop till justice is done." Green's face turned dark, but he backed away, his lips snarled in a snarl. "We'll see about that," he growled, turning and walking back to his car. As he drove off, Martha felt a surge of relief mixed with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the way forward would be tough, but she was more determined than ever to see it in the ensuing days. The movement for justice kept picking up steam with each passing day. Martha's group was able to garner hundreds of signatures, enough to make the town council take cognizance of their demands. But the intimidation tactics on the part of Green did not let up, and every member of the group found themselves being targeted one way or the other. One night, Martha's house was also vandalized. Her windows were broken and her front porch graffiti painted with hurtful messages. She awoke to a small sanctuary defaced. A clear reminder of it was the battle she was fighting. But rather than deter her, the act of aggression only fanned the flames of her resolve. She did the repairs herself, refusing to give Green and his associates the satisfaction of seeing her weakened. As the campaign took hold, more joined their cause, bringing with them stories of injustice that painted a damning portrait of Green's actions. The momentum was undeniable, and Martha could feel the tide beginning to turn. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that, despite the odds, justice might finally be within grasp. But she also knew that Green would not go down without a fight. The pressure he exerted on her and her supporters only intensified, and each new day brought new difficulties, new threats. The battle was far from over, but Martha was ready for whatever lay ahead. It was in the quiet moments of the night, as she prepared for the next day's fight, that Martha found herself thinking of her parents, of the strength they had passed on to her. She knew that they would be proud of her, that they would stand beside her in spirit as she continued her struggle for justice. And as she lay down to sleep, she was at peace, knowing she no longer walked this path in solitude. She had allies, friends, a community that was finally, slowly, waking up to the truth. Martha had chosen her path, and she would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. That evening, the town council meeting was full. Word had it that Martha's group had amassed enough signatures to demand an investigation, and this was palpable as the crowd was a mixture of believers, the curious, and those like Green's allies who were there to daunt and discourage. Martha sat near the front with Sarah close to her side, her hands resting on a stack of papers that held the names of every person who had stood with her. Her heart pounding in her chest. Around her, she felt the weight and strength in the community behind her. It was a moment they'd fought hard for, the culmination of their tireless efforts to expose the truth. The council members filed in, taking their seats with an air of authority. At the head of the table sat Mayor Hale, a man with a reputation for diplomacy, but known to turn a blind eye to unpleasant truths. His expression was impassive as he looked out into the crowd, his gaze briefly meeting Martha's before he looked away. The meeting began with the usual formalities, a droning litany of community updates and minor administrative matters. Yet the tension in the room was unmistakable, a coiled energy that only grew as the agenda finally. He approached the issue that had brought them all here. Mayor Hale cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he spoke. The next OD item on our agenda concerns a formal complaint against Officer Gerald Green and the request for an investigation into allegations of misconduct. He paused, being very neutral in tone. Miss Martha Johnson has requested to speak on behalf of the complainants. All eyes turned to Martha as she rose, her movements steady despite the nerves that threatened to overwhelm her. She held her head high, meeting the gaze quietly, defying the council members as she began to speak. "Thank you, Mayor Hale, and thank you to the members of the council," she said in a clear and sure voice. "I am here tonight because the people of this town deserve to know the truth about the men who are supposed to protect us. Officer Green has used his position of authority to intimidate, humiliate, and harass innocent people. He has turned his back, into a weapon, a tool of fear rather than a symbol of safety." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mix of consensus and unease as Martha's words hung in the air. She continued, her voice growing stronger with each sentence. "I've lived in this town my entire life. I've seen the good, the bad, and everything in between, but I never thought I would see the day when a person like Officer Green would be allowed to abuse his power without consequence." She paused, looking around the room, meeting the eyes of those who had come to support her. "We cannot let this continue. We cannot let fear dictate our lives." As she spoke, Martha felt the surge of strength, the feeling of purpose that lifted her above the fear and doubt. She glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragement, and at Jacob, seated nearby, his eyes filled with admiration and respect. They were all here because of her, because she had chosen to stand up, to break the silence that had kept so many in fear. One of the council members, a stern-faced man named Willis, leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Miss Johnson, while I respect your perspective, do you have any concrete evidence to support these allegations? Officer Green has served this community for years. It's hard to believe he'd act in the way you describe." Martha held up the stack of signed papers. Her voice didn't waver. "This is the testimony of every person who has been affected by Officer Green's actions. Every name on this list represents a story of fear, of intimidation, of harassment. We may not have video footage or audio recordings, but we have the truth, and that is more powerful than any badge." Willis shifted uncomfortably. His gaze darkened. Mayor Hale remained expressionless, The silence dragged on, and tension mounted in the room. The weight of Martha's words settled over the council members like a heavy shroud. And then, from the back of the room, a voice pierced the quiet. "I have a story to share." The crowd turned to see Emma, the single mother who had spoken at one of the group's earlier meetings. She stepped forward, her face pale but resolute, her hands shaking slightly as she clasped them together. My son was harassed by Officer Green. He was only 16. Green stopped him on his accused him of being up to something just because he was walking to the house from school alone. He scared my son so bad, he didn't want to leave the house for weeks. He wouldn't even go to the store for me. Emma's voice cracked, but she pressed on, her eyes bright with determination. No one should have to live in fear, especially not a child. And I won't stand by and let this happen to anyone else. Her words struck a nerve. The truth of her pain resonated with the crowd. A murmur of agreement swept through the room as more and more people out came to speak, sharing their own tales of woe, each adding to the mountainous evidence against Green. Councilman Willis looked visibly ill at ease now, shifting in his seat as more and more voices joined the chorus of complaints. Mayor Hale raised his hand, calling for order, but the momentum had already taken hold. People were no longer content sitting in silence, no longer willing to ignore the wrongs that had plagued their town. Then, as the room fell into a tense hush, the doors swung open and in entered Officer Green himself. He walked taking his place at the front of the room, his eyes swaggering over the crowd as though in challenge for them to continue. He displayed nothing but barely disguised disdain. Martha's eyes flashed with anger, her gaze locked on him as her jaw clenched. She would not be silenced. Not now. Not after all they had fought for. Green began to speak to the council in a calm, practiced voice, but the tone was laced with veiled contempt. Ladies and gentlemen, I have served this community for over a decade. I have dedicated my life to keeping this town safe. And now I am under attack from the baseless accusations of uninformed individuals and the pressures of law enforcement. He paused, glancing at Martha, his features cold, calculating. Miss Johnson, here she's mistaken. She has taken a simple misunderstanding and has turned it into an attack upon my character. I am a law-abiding officer, and I have done naught but serve this town with honor. Martha's fists clenched at her sides as Green began to bend the truth, turning himself into the victim. She knew his words were calculated to instill doubt in the minds of the council members, but she also knew that she had the truth on her side. As Sarah stooped and whispered to Martha, "Don't let him intimidate you. We're here with you." Getting her strength from her allies, Martha stood up once more to speak to the council. Officer Green can deny these allegations all he wants, but the people in this room know the truth. They've lived it. This is not just one misunderstanding. This is a pattern of behavior, one that has hurt too many people for too long. The council members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly torn between the accusations and Green's confident refutations. Mayor Hale cleared his throat, riding his gaze darting between Martha and Green. "This is serious business," he said slowly. "We can't make a decision based on words alone. The evidence has to be reviewed, all parties have to be heard, and a proper investigation has to take place before we can decide the course of action." It was not the decisive victory Martha had hoped for, but it was in the right direction. The council had committed to an inquiry, and that was more than could have been asked or hoped for only a few weeks ago. As the meeting drew to a close, Martha felt a sense of relief intermingled with still lingering uncertainty. She had fought with everything she had, and though the battle was far from over, she knew that at last, the wheels of justice were finally beginning to turn. But as she left the meeting, she caught sight of Green standing by the door, his expression dark and threatening. He didn't say a word, but the message in his gaze was clear. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. By far, the longest shot was that Martha felt a chill run down her spine, but she squared her shoulders, refusing to let fear cower. She had come too far, fought too hard to back down now. With her allies by her side, she would see this fight through to the end, no matter the cost. As she walked out into the cool night air, Martha knew that the hardest part of the battle still lay ahead, but she was ready for it, prepared to face whatever challenges lay in her path. She had found her voice, and she would not be silenced again. The days following the tense, quiet anticipation filled the council meeting. Rumors swirled through town about the investigation into Officer Green, but a few folks doubted that anything would come from it. Martha and her small delegation were optimistic, though, as for the first time, a glimmer of accountability existed when the council had promised to review the accusations. Green, however, was not about to go down without a fight. He started showing up at odd times, shadowing Martha when she ran errands, waiting outside her house with his patrol car, idling under the street lights. As if to dare her to take the next step, his dark form hovered over her like a shadow, an ever-present threat. Yet Martha refused to yield to his intimidation tactic. Martha's group continued to secretly meet, sharing updates on the investigation and discussing further actions. Sarah, ever resilient, urged them to hold firm, pointing out that Green's desperation was proof that their AC actions were having an impact. Each meeting strengthened their resolve, and as the days passed, more people joined their cause, unwilling to remain silent in the face of injustice. Then, one crisp evening, Martha received a call from Mayor Hale. He sounded cautious, almost nervous, as he informed her that the investigation was complete and the council was ready to announce their decision. The news sent a ripple of anticipation through the group, and they agreed to gather at the council hall the following evening to hear the verdict together. The council hall was packed when they arrived, the atmosphere charged. Martha sat in the very front row, flanked by Sarah and Jacob, her heart racing as she awaited the start of the proceedings. Green was there, too, sitting with a group of his cohorts toward the back of the room. His face was calm, even smug, as if he had already determined the verdict to go his way. The members of the council took their seats, and Mayor Hale stepped forward, clearing his throat before he began to speak. Thank you all for coming. After a thorough review of the complaints and testimonies brought forth, we have reached a decision regarding Officer Green's conduct. This has not been an easy process, and we appreciate the patience of everyone involved. He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd with a carefully neutral expression. The council has decided that Officer Green's actions were in direct violation of the ethical standards of our police force and the trust placed in him by the community. Effective immediately, Officer Green will be relieved of his duties, pending in further investigation and disciplinary action. A murmur of shock and relief, the applause spread through the room, and Martha felt a tide of sentiment ripple through her. She turned to Sarah, who clenched her hand with a smile, at Jacob, whose face beamed with pride. This was the victory they fought for, the justice they had demanded. Green's face darkened, and he rose to his feet. Disintegration set in. This is a joke. He spat the words out laced with furor. I have given years to this town, protected these people, and this is how they repay me. Mayor Hale raised his hand. His tone was firm. Officer Green, please sit down. The council has reached its verdict, but Green wasn't done. His eyes sliced to Martha, a dangerous glint in the depths. This isn't over, he snarled in a low, menacing voice. You think you've won, but you haven't seen the last of me. Martha did not flinch. Neither did her expression soften as she held his glare. There was nothing he could do to intimidate her now, after everything she had striven for. She could feel the energy of her supporters around her. A solid wall Green could no longer rattle. The council meeting was adjourned, and as the crowd began to disperse, Martha found herself surrounded by friends and neighbors, all offering words of support and gratitude. Emma, the mother whose story had helped fuel their fight, hugged Martha tightly, her eyes filled with tears of relief. Thank you, Martha, she whispered. You did this. You made this happen. Martha smiled, feeling the warmth of the community around her. We did this, all of us. It was our voices together that made the difference. As she left the council hall that evening, Martha felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The fight had been long and painful, but it had been worth it. She had her dignity back, her voice, and through that act had helped bring justice into a town that for so long had remained silent. Over the ensuing weeks, new optimism took hold in the town. Green's exit sent a powerful signal, a reminder that nobody was beyond accountability. The change was possible where people stood together. Martha's group continued to meet, their focus shifting toward new goals, reform advocacy, support of victims of injustice, and the voices of the in. No one was ever muted for that evening. As Martha took a gentle stroll through the now familiar park right there by the fountain, her heart swelling with silent pride. She thought about her parents and their quiet strength and resilience. She knew they would be proud of the path she had chosen to take. A legacy given to her from them was one in which she was never to give up no matter how hard it got, and she continued living that legacy to this very day, carrying their strength on with her as she pioneered forward. Still there standing, Sarah approached her, expression contemplative. "It's hard to believe it's over," she said softly. Martha smiled, catching the vision of the young woman who had been her ally, her friend through it all. "Not over," she replied, a hint of determination in her voice. "Just the beginning." Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with admiration. "You're right, there's still work to be done." Together they strolled through the park, side by side, the weight of the pea lifting as they looked towards the future. Martha knew the fight for justice would never truly be over, yet she was ready for whatever came next. She had found her voice, and with her voice, a new purpose. As they neared the edge of the park, Martha turned and looked back one last time. In the quiet strength of the town surrounding her lay the knowledge that she had indeed reclaimed her dignity, her voice, and she knew that she was no longer alone. With friends by her side, she continued to stand in for justice for herself and for all those coming behind her. The air that night was cool, filled with autumn scent. Leaves herald a new beginning, and Martha knew as she walked home that the legacy of resilience and courage would live on, carried forward by every voice that dared speak out against injustice. This was her victory, her legacy, and this was only the beginning. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new stories. Be sure to check out the other videos on the channel. There's more to come.